Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Marianne Hensley, and I'm the Director of Digital Media Content here at FreightWaves. And we are happy to be presenting this monthly market update webinar in partnership with Convoy, which is dedicated to utilizing technology to bring reliability, transparency, insights, and efficiency to the trucking and supply chain industry. Today's market update is going to touch on the latest events affecting freight, and we'll be hearing from Craig Fuller, FreightWaves CEO, as well as FreightWaves Chief Economist Ibrahim Bayan, and our Senior Meteorologist Nick Austin, all of whom really live and breathe in this industry day in and day out. Before we get started, I'd just like to cover a couple of housekeeping items. First, if you have any issues during the webinar, please feel free to reach out to our team via the chat function on your Zoom control panel. Also, if you have questions that you would like to ask our presenters, please enter those through the Q&A box in your control panel, and we'll answer those as we get to the live Q&A following the presentations. We'll also be sending a link to the recording of this webinar if you'd like to view it on demand or share it with your peers. And so now I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Craig and Ibrahim and Nick to share their insights on the latest factors affecting the freight market today.
Well, welcome, everyone. Ibrahim, welcome back. It's good to see you again for our third market update. It's fall, it's a great time, and we have a new voice to the show today, Nick Austin, who is now the Senior Meteorologist here at FreightWaves. We're excited, Nick, that you've joined us.
I'm excited about it too.
So Nick has been a late addition. Not only was yesterday his first official day, but also we added him to the agenda at the last minute. Nick is a meteorologist here in is here in town, has been in town for the last 20 years, and we're excited to have him as part of the FreightWaves team. And we're going to talk a little bit about the hurricane. We're going to start with that, and then we're going to dive into the broader trends in the freight market. But we figured we should go ahead and do that some service because it has been a big topic.
It has, and the big issue is the flooding. Way more than wind, which are both always factors with hurricanes, but the flooding has really been the big issue. It's closed sections of interstates. It's closed a lot of other roads across mostly North Carolina and a few parts of South Carolina and Virginia as well. So just a lot of those throughways are closed. Record rainfall for a lot of the area, and it just rained so hard for 3 to 4 days straight. And anytime that happens, you're going to get major flooding. And the thing is, the rivers are still rising, so the problem's not going to go away anytime soon. So it's going to be a problem getting in there to as far as getting in there to help, as far as getting any kind of supplies in there, anything for the cleanup. It's going to be really tough. And
so we're going to dive into that in a few minutes. Dive into how the hurricane, specifically the flooding, is impacting things. And so we'll talk a little bit about not only the short-term impacts to weather, but also how that will impact the market in the third and fourth quarters and beyond. We'll talk a little bit about, Ibrahim's going to talk about manufacturing activity and survey performance, as well as the always important topic of trucking employment trends. And then we'll dive into regional trends. And there's been some questions that have been prior to this that people want to understand about this thing called IMO or EMO 2020, and I think we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how the diesel market could potentially be impacted by this new regulation. So pretty exciting agenda for today. So real quick, my background, and actually I took Nick's thunder, so I'll let him give a quick, because he was a late addition, we didn't add his bio in here, so you won't see his mug. But I've been in trucking my whole life, literally grew up in it, and excited to be back here. And then Ibrahim was a senior economist at UPS. And
senior economist at UPS for about a decade, joined FreightWaves earlier this year. And you know, my background has been trying to understand macroeconomic trends and the impact on transportation markets.
And Nick, do you want to give a 2-second overview of
real quick. Well, I've been a broadcast meteorologist for 17 years. Yeah, the last 8 of those have been here in Chattanooga at a local station. So mainly doing local forecasting so that people can get through their day and through their week and just for everyday life. But I'm looking forward to using my background in a totally different way now.
It's exciting to have you. I am glad you're off of our television program. So Nick was the evening and weekend weatherman here in the local station here in Chattanooga. So My wife and I, when he pops up on the screen, it's usually not welcome. So we're glad to see you outside of that. So. Yeah, so this is good. This is our third one. Certainly appreciate everyone coming. A little bit about FreightWaves. We won't spend a lot of time on it, but effectively what we do is we're building this community to help companies analyze, react, forecast, and de-risk the freight markets. And so taking in these different trends and data sets and providing analytics can hopefully help folks understand what's actually happening. So thank you for, so I've been told I had notes at the bottom, but now it's off. A little bit of behind the scenes is we've got a number of PhDs that are actually studying data. We have 2 full-time economists. Ibrahim runs our economics team, market reporters, and now we have our newest addition is our meteorologist. And we'll talk a little bit about how weather not only is involved in the freight market in these kind of macro black swan-esque events, if you can call a hurricane that, I don't know. But also more broadly how weather drives demand cycles in the freight market. And we'll spend just a couple of seconds on that, not too deep today, because we have a big agenda. So we always talk about the importance of data and tribal knowledge, which is the idea that data should govern our decisions. And we think that one of the reasons FreightWaves is successful is because we use a lot of data to understand the market. And then more importantly, or perhaps as importantly, is this concept of tribal knowledge, which is these instinctual things that we understand, that we're able to interpret without having to necessarily understand why they exist. And so that's really this kind of shared tribal knowledge, which we think really enhances our story. So I will now turn it over to Nick to talk about the weather.
Okay, here we are. We're still talking about Florence, even though it made landfall last Friday, but it was a pretty major storm, again, mainly because of the rainfall and the flooding. And it was kind of unusual that the Carolinas, North Carolina, got a direct hit from this hurricane. If you look at the history since about 1950 or so of all the hurricanes that were in the same position as Florence, and this map shows about, I think, 5 or 6 days before landfall. Rarely does a storm make a direct hit on the Carolinas like that. It usually just goes way out to sea. So it was a pretty big deal. I think it probably posed some challenges as far as getting prepared, but I think the folks there got as ready as they could, because a lot of them did evacuate, the local governments, everybody else was ready, because just a couple of years ago that area got hit by Matthew, which was pretty major, and Floyd was a big one back in '99. So they don't get hit as often as, say, South Florida or even the Gulf Coast, but I think they were pretty prepared, which was important. But it was an unusual track for the storm, that's for sure. And I mean, these are just a handful of some of the record rainfalls in the area, especially along the coastal spots. I mean, talking about some areas like North Myrtle Beach and up towards Swansboro, I mean, getting 2 to 3 times as much rain from just this storm over a few days than they would normally get in the whole month of September. It was just unbelievable, and that's why the rivers swelled. And frankly, that's why they're still going to keep rising, because the ground is just so saturated that it takes a long time, possibly another 4 to maybe 7 days before the rivers start to recede, before they can really get in there and start doing some major cleanup, and before they might even start letting people back there if they want to go back. So it's just unbelievable how much rain that they got in these areas. So cleanup's going to be a major issue, and one, for health reasons. Number 2, just you won't be able to get in there, because there's going to be still a lot of flooded roads over the next several days. So whether it's for relief efforts, deliveries for supplies and things like that, it's just going to be really difficult. So, and this is just a little comparison to Matthew, which was 2 years ago, back in 2016. And some of the rivers in the area actually have been rising and cresting even higher than from Matthew. So the rain has really been the big deal. The cleanup effort could take months to really complete. And there are going to be issues, health and environmental issues with all this too, because chemicals, all kinds of biohazards in the area, just stuff. There was the breach at the coal ash, there was an ash spill. And there's just all kinds of things going on where chemicals and other biohazards get into the water system when you have this kind of flooding. So that's going to be an issue for folks who are going to be involved in the cleanup, whether it's government or just volunteers, just anybody helping out. So, and trying to get those supplies in there, they're going to need hazmat supplies.
Yeah, one of the things that, we mentioned the coal, but one of the things that's also been talked a lot about is this significant exposure to agriculture
Absolutely.
in North Carolina, and perhaps most specifically around pork, because
Right.
North Carolina is a huge producer of pork. It's the #2 in the United States. And there's really two issues. One is the devastation to the agricultural commodity and the fact that these pigs are at risk. But also the hazard, you mentioned hazard associated with just their waste now circulating through different river systems and things like that. So that's creating a biohazard issue that probably will exacerbate the problem even further than just flooding. One of the things that we've watched here is the futures contracts on because of the significant impact to the hog supply or the pork supply. Futures contracts have been up 15% since August 30th. So we're actually seeing it priced into the market. People are assuming that there will be a pork shortage or a tighter amount of supply related to what happened there. So one of the things that we've measured and have been looking a lot about is what happens in these storms are really kind of three processes. You have the run-up, which usually includes people staging relief supplies to put them into warehouses or onto military installations prior to the hurricane hitting, so that those products are pre-staged. The other thing that happens is there's the actual storm itself, which staging is happening on the peripheral, the outside of these disaster sites, and then you have the relief project. But one of the things that we've been looking at is, well, how does this actually show up in the data? And so one of the indices that we have is something called trucks in market, which measures a rolling average of 2 weeks of whether there are new trucks in or out of a market, and what the stability of that market is in terms of supply. And what we saw in Raleigh, North Carolina, is that the trucking activity, the total amount of trucks in and out of that market, dropped by 30% in a 2-day stretch. And you can actually see that. That other kind of nasty deterioration was actually Labor Day. But you're seeing also that when this took place, that 30% of the supply actually left the Raleigh market. So a lot of carriers move their trucks out of harm's way, as they rightfully should, even if they're not involved in the relief project. And if they are, they're retasked onto other things, into other markets. Now, what was also interesting is looking at areas that were outside of the storm and identifying what the additional capacity is. So as people were bringing supplies in, how does that actually drive the local market? And you can see from September 12th, which was before the hurricane hit, to where we're at on the 16th, is that the amount of trucks going into Atlanta bringing supplies, because that's where you stage them, was up 12%. So a pretty sizable impact as companies and government officials pushed supply of product into around the Carolinas. The other thing that we looked at is tender rejections. This is, I think, interesting because you have total amount of tender rejections in the market, and tender rejections show up when you have a shortness of capacity or a lack of options. We actually saw tender rejections go from about 17% right before the storm on that Charlotte to Atlanta lane to about 25%. And why is that interesting? It's really interesting for two things. One is it tells you that there weren't enough trucks. Carriers decline loads if they don't have trucks in the position to take it. So they just didn't have trucks available for dispatch in that market. The other thing is telling us is that a lot of that capacity in the Carolinas has been moved to take on relief projects and other things for disaster relief. And so it's actually showing in the data that we're actually seeing. Just looking at how top markets in the U.S. are trending, you can see Atlanta is about 4.5%, Ontario, California is about 4%. If you take the LA, we actually divide up LAX and Ontario as two separate markets. LA combined is about 7%, so it's actually much bigger. Ontario is that inland part where you see a lot of intermodal traffic. Joliet, Illinois is at 3.3. Harrisburg is about 3.3 as well. Houston is a market, really big exposure to oil in the energy markets, and then Dallas at 2.47. So you're seeing these are kind of the freight markets as they stand in terms of total market share for the freight markets and how they've trended. One thing that is interesting is as we get closer to e-commerce, we're seeing increasing amount of demand take place and increasing amount of volume take place in Southern California as people forward position e-commerce traffic and retail traffic. The other thing, going back actually to what's happening in the Carolinas, we saw a significant surge. And basically, if you look at Charlotte this year, the highest percent of increase that they've seen in terms of demand was actually right after the hurricane was announced. As people said, Florence is going to make a landfall in the Carolinas, we saw this massive surge of freight activity going into Charlotte. And so Charlotte had its biggest week in terms of relative market share to the rest of the market actually this past week. So we're seeing a lot of demand put product and supplies into Charlotte. Charlotte makes sense because it's furthest. I mean, Nick, you have anything to add to this? It's far enough inland where trucks can get in and out, but it's close enough to where they can actually do some good.
Perfect way to say it. Exactly. It's at a good location. Exactly how I would describe it. Yeah.
The other market that also saw a significant kind of surge of inbound activity was Atlanta. Atlanta also, for many, perhaps not as close to, well, certainly not as close as Charlotte, but Atlanta being this mecca, a metropolis, has a lot of warehouse facilities and facilities to put equipment. It's also a natural place to drop freight off because you have a very dynamic and liquid market for capacity. And so we also saw a lot of demand into Atlanta as products were shifted into kind of those forward centers that may be passed off to a local carrier as people figured out what the path of the storm was going to take. Also, one more thing is, I think this is really interesting. One of the other indices that we use on Sonar is called this head haul index. And basically what head haul does is it shows on a daily basis which markets have more outbound freight than inbound freight. And we actually saw right as the storm was hitting that the Carolinas switched from really a head haul market. So the wider it is the more of a backhaul to a backhaul market. And all that means is that there's a ton more freight going into the Carolinas than there's coming out. And that's because over the next couple of months, the Carolinas are going to be consuming a lot of goods and not producing very much. Because as you mentioned, the flooding is going to take a while. The agriculture hazards are going to take a while to kind of figure out. And so there's going to be a lot of product coming out of the Carolinas. You're going to see the Carolinas actually become a big market for inbound activity, which we're already seeing. And again, one more thing, just to talk a little bit more about this, and you can actually see this in Charlotte as well as in Raleigh, is that just getting back to the local data, is you see both these markets kind of shift into this backhaul market as it relates to what's happening. So if you want to, I'm going to turn it over now. I think Ibrahim's going to talk a little bit about the economic impact of Hurricane Florence.
Sure. So, I mean, typically when you have these kind of events, these weather events, there's two aspects that affect economic activity. The first is the damage side of it. So, you know, I'm always interested to see sort of how much damage is being caused by the flooding and the wind from these kinds of storms. And then the other piece of it is just sort of the displacement that occurs because of storm activity, that people are lose power or they're forced to evacuate from a particular area. Manufacturers have to shut down, businesses stop operating for certain numbers of days while the storm kind of plays itself out. And this also disrupts normal economic activity in the region, and sometimes that activity spills over to the broader economy. Now, when you look at sort of what some of the early estimates are for damages caused by Hurricane Florence, there's a wide range of projections out there right now, and I think it'll probably be that way, you know, as people sort of get a handle on all the things that were affected. But what I've kind of circled in on is around $15 to $20 billion worth of damages to property in that area. To put that into perspective, last year Hurricane Harvey was one of the bigger storms that the U.S. has ever experienced. That was about $125 billion to $150 billion worth of damages done. So Florence is definitely smaller when it comes, I mean, in terms of just pure damage. But again, the other question is sort of like, how long is the disruption going to last? Nick mentioned earlier that the floodwaters are still out there in North Carolina, and they're not expected to recede for several days, and then cleanup, even once the floods subside, is a month-long or a couple month-long kind of process. And during all of this time, you're not going to have normal business activity. Now, from an economic perspective, a lot of that stuff just gets made up later. So that if you're a household and you weren't buying because you were evacuated in somewhere else, sort of when things settle down, you go back and you purchase all the things that you were going to purchase ahead of time. In most cases, like things like restaurant sales, they don't ever really make up what they lost. It's not like you go back and eat twice as much when you don't, and eat out twice as much when you get displaced. But things like car purchases and like appliances and furniture, if you were going to make those purchases and you couldn't because you were disrupted, that kind of stuff will get made up in the October data and things like that. And then the other thing is there's going to be a significant amount of rebuilding activity, I think, that goes on. Like all that property damage usually ends up in just more construction activity, more housing activity that otherwise wouldn't take place. And so the net, when it's all said and done, ends up being a slight net positive to overall economic activity. I think that when September numbers get released, there's going to be some disruptions there, some noise there. Things might come in a lot weaker than they otherwise might. But I think as October, November, December numbers come in, it'll make up for a lot of the weakness that you see then. So where are we just in general for the current economic situation? Right now I have projections for a little less than 3% GDP growth for this quarter. With the caveat being, I'm kind of waiting to see how long this hurricane disruption lasts. If it turns into something that takes like a significant chunk out of September activity, it might come in a little bit lower than that. But I think that the key thing to remember is that we're in a slightly weaker economic environment in the third quarter than what we experienced in the second quarter. The second quarter was one of the just a really great growth quarter for the U.S. economy. I think we're pulling back a bit from that one way, or even outside of what was going on with the hurricane. Still some pretty good positives for the third quarter. I think business investment still strong in the economy. Consumer spending has been strong over the past several months. I expect it to continue to be strong the rest of this year. And then I think in the third quarter, you'll start to see some inventory building, especially as businesses start to gear up for the peak season this year. So there's still some pretty good positives out there for third quarter growth. But that's not, everything's not firing on all cylinders right now. There are some significant areas of weakness that are emerging in the U.S. economy. For one, international trade has become a bigger issue. Some of the export numbers haven't been looking really good lately, and I think trade is going to subtract an awful lot from third quarter growth when the numbers are released. Housing has been really kind of stuck over the past several months and hasn't seen any kind of growth after some pretty positive news towards the end of last year. And that has some negative implications for overall economic activity. And then, of course, whatever the hurricane impacts end up being, I think are going to probably subtract from the third quarter overall, made up in the fourth quarter, maybe the first quarter of next year.
Now, real quick, on housing, obviously the West Coast has had a housing slowdown, but then I noticed something yesterday is that DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth, one of the top housing markets in the country, is also seeing somewhat of a slowdown. Is this a nationwide issue?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think housing just in general is suffering from a number of different kind of factors that are restraining activity. Like on the buying side, you have the fact that inventory is still pretty, like there's just not a lot of houses for sale, and prices have been rising in response. And then at the same time, you have rising mortgage rates, and that makes home sale activity a lot weaker than it otherwise could be. I think housing demand is probably out there, but the lack of just affordable housing is becoming a problem. And then on the supply side, we're finding more and more builders reporting that they just can't find developed lots to build on, that they just can't find the land, and so that's kind of restraining housing starts and construction activity overall.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about the commodities. I think you have to look at the products that are transported. So energy continues to be incredibly strong as these kind of geopolitical structure impacts of what's happening with Iran what's happening in Venezuela. That's going to continue to impact energy demand or energy supply around the world, which is going to create this floor, if you will, on on oil prices and other commodities that are related to energy. As long as the economy stays strong, energy prices should stay relatively strong, and that is a huge driver of freight demand. And I think that's a part that we don't think a lot in the United States about how important energy is to freight, but it is a huge driver of freight demand. The other is, of course, agriculture, being 25%. Now, keep in mind, this is not just trucking. This includes rail and other modes of traffic. But all of those modes are interconnected because capacity on the rail also takes capacity off of adds capacity to the roads and to the trucks and so forth. And so all of this stuff being interconnected actually impacts it. But you can look at the different commodities. You mentioned construction. Things that we see in construction are like wood and the furniture when people are building their homes. Those things certainly have an impact on the overall freight demand. So understanding how the commodities flow actually impacts it.
So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time to go over some of the key drivers, I think, of freight demand. You know, because of the hurricane, this may be the last kind of clean month we get to look at data for a while. You know, I would expect, again, that as September numbers roll in, they may be artificially or weaker than what the fundamentals might suggest because of hurricane activity. And then October and November numbers may be positive in the other direction because of some of the payback from earlier disruptions. And so, you know, I think the August data it's interesting to look at to give just sort of a state of where freight demand stands outside of all the noise that's about to come. So on the retail side, I think things look very positive. Overall retail spending has been growing in each of the last 7 months. It's over 6.5% higher than at this point last year. That's very strong by historical standards. Now, you know, keep in mind the retail numbers, they're nominal numbers, which means that they're not like inflation adjusted. So rising prices playing some of a role. But even once you account for that, I think retail is in a pretty good space. When you look at sort of the sub-industries within retail, almost every sector of retail is experiencing positive growth, a couple exceptions. Department stores still kind of struggling. And then the other piece is just some of the things related to housing, things like furniture sales, appliance sales, building material sales. Those have also done fairly poorly because housing's been doing fairly poorly in the economy.
But it is interesting because the discounters have done well as the luxury.
Sure.
And it seems like in the last quarter, we saw most retailers actually blow out their earnings, had exceptionally good earnings. Is there anything fundamentally driving that, or is it just consumers feel great about the economy?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is that. I mean, job growth is good, income growth is good, confidence is high, and so this is going to lead to a pretty good retail environment. And I think when you go forward, you know, these next couple months, they're really important for the retailers, like the November, December month. I expect a very strong retail holiday season. You know, last year was also a pretty good holiday season as well, but I would say even on top of that, that retail sales activity is probably going to be even stronger this year. And we're really going to test sort of a lot of transportation companies when it comes to the November, December timeframe, because there's going to be a lot of things moving around during the peak months.
Do you think we're going to have a huge peak?
I think it's going to be a very, very healthy growth. But retail in general has been one of the strong points in the economy, I think, really since the first couple months of the year. The other piece that I typically look at is industrial production. The white line here is total industrial production, which is nearing 5% growth year over year. To put that into some kind of perspective, that's the best kind of growth we've seen in IP since the end of 2010. And so you're looking at like over 7 years kind of highs that we're seeing in overall industrial production. On the manufacturing side, growth is above 3%. Again, that's the highest that we've seen in years, not quite as long of a history as the total IP number, but the strongest growth since, say, 2012 that we've seen on the manufacturing side. The one thing that I would bring out here is that when you look at the details within industrial production, a lot of the strength is coming out of the energy sector. That what's driving a bunch of it is just mining and drilling activity. Mining production itself is up, I think, 14% year over year in the economy. But even when you look outside of mining, a lot of the activity that's going on in machinery production or primary metal production, a good chunk of that is just devoted to supporting the mining and drilling sector. And so I don't want to sort of understate the importance of what energy and mining activity is to the overall economy. There was a lot of areas of weakness within manufacturing in this most recent month. Like the non-durable side of the economy was doing pretty poorly, but it's just all of this business investment in mining, all of this equipment that's used for mining, and then the actual mining output itself is driving an awful lot of the growth there on the production side of the economy. So I wanted to take a minute to take a look at some of the survey data, because I think it highlights some pretty important trends within the economy and within transportation as well. This is the ISM index, which is a purchasing managers index. Essentially what a purchasing managers index is a survey of purchasing managers across the manufacturing sector. And so they ask these purchasing managers about various aspects of business. Like what's your production looking like? What are your new orders looking like? What are your inventories looking like? What's employment looking like? And things of that nature. And they ask whether or not activity is expanding or contracting. Right? Very simple. Is it expanding? Is it contracting? And the number that comes out is essentially the percentage of respondents that say that activity is expanding. So anything above 50 means more than half of the respondents are saying expansion. If it falls below 50, that means more than half are saying that activity is contracting. Historically, when you have readings above 55, that means good, solid, sort of trend-like growth in the economy. The manufacturing sector has been well above that throughout the course of this year. I mean, you can see it's kind of been flirting around this 60 level for the better part of the year. It hit a 14-year high in the most recent data point, which was August. And this just sort of underscores how strong the manufacturing sector has been in the economy. Now, when you drill into some of these sort of individual responses, it highlights some pretty important trends as to what manufacturers are experiencing. I picked out two. One is the backlog of orders. The other is supplier deliveries. The backlog of orders measures sort of how many orders remain unfilled by manufacturers, that they're getting these orders but they can't quite fill them. So the backlog is rising. And you can see very strong readings there, like well above 60 for these backlogs of orders here. I mean, well above 55 for the backlogs of orders. The other piece is supplier deliveries, which measures how long it's taking for them to get the supplies that they need to produce things, and with higher readings meaning longer time. Okay, and you can see that these readings have been well above 60. Like you're having these exceptionally long supplier delivery times. Now this is a sign that like there's some bottlenecks here in the production process. When you read individual survey responses, and they highlight the trucking shortage as part of it. They say, well, we would love to produce more, but we can't find trucks to get the stuff in time in order to produce what we need to produce. And so I actually think the manufacturing data would be even stronger than what it is now, but there's just some bottlenecks that are keeping things from being as strong as it otherwise might be.
So you mentioned oil, and I think we spend a lot of time on it. We're going to talk a little bit deeper in a second, but we are seeing some stability in diesel prices, which is suggesting that we're at a point where the supply has kind of rebounded from the commodity crash of 15, 16, and now we're seeing it come to a place where we're seeing supply kind of properly provide, at a higher price point, provide the amount of supply that the industry is demanding, or broadly the economy is demanding. And so that's great that we also have this really high, $70+ oil, because that's actually encouraging a lot of exploration and development and investments in parts for oil exploration. You mentioned how important that is to drive the broader manufacturing sector, and it also drives the freight sector because that ends up, all that product has to be moved to a rig site. It certainly does impact the cost of transportation because those prices of oil get passed on to the trucking companies, which then pass them on to shippers. And by doing that, it creates a secondary inflationary environment for truck spot prices and contract prices. But having said that, a healthy oil market, so long as it stays within a band, is actually a net positive to U.S. trucking, the U.S. trucking market.
Yeah, and just to add on, I mean, this is one of the oil prices in general is one of the indicators that I'm looking at so the most when it comes to what overall freight demand looks like these days. I mean, I mentioned earlier about how much of just like production and manufacturing is tied to energy. But there's a chance that you know, if global conditions weaken, you could see a drop in oil prices. And if that happens, then that's going to be one of the kind of things that might change the direction of things.
And it's one thing that we don't appreciate too much in our industry, but that is actually, if you go back and look at when we saw the market collapse in 15 and 16, it actually shows up, and you can look at this on this slide specifically, is the Department of Energy diesel price started to drop in about March of 14, and it went progressively down to where it collapsed in 15, the end of 14 and 15. And that should have been a warning sign for the market. I think the truckers were thinking, I'm making so much money because of the oil prices have gone down, my cost of moving freight's gone down. But in reality, what was happening, and it was kind of a canary in the coal mine about U.S. economic activity, yeah, or global economic activity for that matter.
So, you know, I mentioned earlier about housing and some of the weakness that's been coming out of the housing sector in recent months. You know, you can look at this. I mean, housing data in general is choppy. I included like a 4-month moving average here to try and smooth things out a little bit. But generally speaking, the economy went into the end of last year thinking that housing was kind of ready to pick up because consumer conditions and household wealth conditions were pretty solid. Housing demand seemed to be pretty strong, and housing data had been improving fairly steadily heading into 2018. And then things sort of flattened a bit in the beginning months of 2018. And then recently, the past couple months, it's just kind of dropped. When you look at here, I have housing starts. You can see the big drop off in June and July in housing starts in the data. And there's been similar kind of drop offs in home sales, both existing home sales and new home sales. And it's really just, it's been one of the real areas of weakness that remains in the economy. And I think it'll continue to be weakness in the third and the fourth quarter of this year.
The other part of the economy, you mentioned housing, but auto has also fallen off. We've seen kind of peak auto. There's actually a lot of schools of thought that the auto markets will never come to the level of auto production because of these macro trends with Uberization and the fact that millennials are not buying as many cars as they used to in the past. The baby boomers are not driving as often. People are locating in cities. I mean, do you think this is a macro trend? Do we think we've seen peak auto?
Sure. I mean, with the exception of, you know, maybe some kind of one-time surge or a brief period where things kind of climb back up, I do think that when you look longer term, the demand for autos is going to be going down, especially for when you look at just like light vehicles, like light vehicle production and light vehicle sales. I think it kind of peaked somewhere around 2014, 2015, and it's leveled off and trended down since then. And I would expect like longer term that's going to kind of be the case for the U.S. economy. There was quite a bit of pent-up demand coming out of the recession, and that helped autos for a few years. But I think most of that is spent up now. And so the other thing that I mentioned earlier was just the recent performance in trade. Here I have goods exports in the U.S. economy, and you can see just the drop over the past couple of months in goods exports. You know, when you look at sort of trade performance, there's a component of it that's related to tariffs. You know, there was some pre-buying by some of our export partners for things that were planned, that had planned tariffs that were about to be slapped on them, which helps some of the data in like April and May of this year. And we're sort of seeing some of the payback from that now. Like when you look at agricultural exports, for example, like those have fallen off of a cliff over the past couple of months. And a lot of that is just because that some of our partners bought soybean exports earlier than they otherwise might. And I think as you go forward, exports is still going to be sort of a challenge. You know, I've always been a bigger believer in the big drivers. Like I don't ascribe a whole lot to tariffs. I think the big drivers of what's going on is really just like global growth conditions, the strength of the U.S. dollar, and things like that. Like that that in my mind moves the needle on trade more than, say, tariffs or things like that. And the dollar's been getting stronger over the past couple of months, and that's going to be an issue. I mean, it's not all that different from what happened in 2014, where the dollar gained an awful lot of strength at the end of 2014, and then exports were a challenge all throughout 2015, and it was an awful lot cheaper to import things. So I think the import market looks pretty good because of that, but exports are going to be a bit of a challenge going forward. And so tying all this demand stuff together for freight rates, you can see freight rates. This is long distance truckload PPI data, and it pulled back a little bit in August. You know, keep in mind though that rates are still on average about 9% higher than at this point last year. I don't think I really expected growth to continue on like the 11 to 12% that we had seen in the previous month going forward. I would still characterize the overall freight market as kind of tight. And I think when September data comes in, you're going to see some hurricane noise here also. But I think as a general trend, I think the year-over-year growth is going to start moderating some going forward, for no other reason than the fact that like the comparisons are going to be tougher. Like we're starting to compare against rapid increases from last year. We don't have the easy comparisons that we had earlier this year. And so I think just the year-over-year growth rates are going to start moderating a little bit.
One of the things I think I would look at, Wall Street tends to get caught up in daily spot rates or weekly spot rates, and they seem to be very concerned when they see spot rates drop, but this is a sign that the freight market's dropping. What's happened in reality is that a lot of the small operators that have entered the market, it's very hard to pin down on how big of a market that is in terms of additional capacity. If they enter the spot market, as you have more people participate in the spot market, that doesn't necessarily mean that the contract market's going to collapse. And so as you don't see the runaway spot market prices that we saw, 4 or 5 months ago, that doesn't mean that the broader sector is actually slowing down. And what's happening is the broader sector actually seems to be incredibly bullish in terms of what's happening. The market seems very stable. We're just seeing less volatility than what we saw in the spot market.
Yeah, and I mean, I think at least as a 2018 sort of story, I think it'll be that way. I've kind of mentioned in each one of these things that we've had that it'll be a little bit of a different story when we get to 2019. There's going to be some things that have been tailwinds this year that aren't going to be tailwinds anymore. And so we'll see the dynamics change a little bit. But I think for this year, the remainder of this year, early part of next year, I think things still look pretty solid. Switching gears a little bit to look on the capacity side, here is just trucking employment in the economy. And you can see just a continuation of rising trucking employment this year over the past several months, with the exception of April data, which saw a pretty significant drop. Trucking employment's been rising fairly steadily. And I think that the pace of growth in trucking employment is outpacing the overall economy. That means that like there's more trucking hiring going on than say general hiring overall. Although
so the carriers are having more success than perhaps we accept.
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, the problem is we always compare trucking employment to things like manufacturing and construction. They're having even better success than trucking is.
Yeah.
Which means that sort of trucking is adding some capacity, but I don't know if it's quite fast enough to keep pace with everything. So one of the things I wanted to touch on this time was just to dig into this trucking number a little bit to give an idea of like how we identify whether or not capacity is coming in or not. And so I took the number that comes in the previous page, this previous page, this 1.48 million trucking employees. And I just wanted to see where all of it was, right? And so you can see about half of it takes place in long distance freight trucking, right? And then there's another part which is long distance specialized freight trucking, which would be things like motor vehicle carriers and things like that. And so overall, you're looking at about 2/3, like 60% of 2/3 is this long distance. The yellow and the orange, these are local trucking employees. And then sort of like the green would be like moving, like U-Haul and Ryder kind of moving goods around types of thing, moving used goods around employment.
So for the audience that typically tunes in here, the 765,000 is the one that they should be pretty sensitive about.
Well, I mean, I would say the 765,000 plus the 136, which is, I mean, they're also long distance truckers.
Those are long distance specialized.
Yeah. I think reefers would qualify as like a specialized freight trucking. And so I just wanted to see like how the long distance employment was growing relative to the local, right? And you can see like over the past few months, most of the hiring has been taking place in this long distance side of trucking employment, right? I mean, for a while they were kind of growing together, but local employment really hasn't changed that much over the past couple months. Like it fell in April and never really recovered at all from it. But trucking hires in this long distance segment have been increasing each of the past few months.
But one of the things, and we didn't have this data, but we have it on Sonar, is that the capacity shortages aren't showing up in mass and local. We're not seeing the rejection levels that we see in some of the over-the-road stuff.
Right, exactly. Like I think the overall capacity issue is a bigger, like it's more of a long distance kind of story in general. And so it's good news to see that at least the hiring's taking place in the right place.
In the areas where they're having some success.
Right. So just to wrap up, again, a lot of things over the next couple months are going to depend on the overall hurricane impact. It's still a little bit early to tell sort of how big of an overall impact the hurricane's going to have on the economy or freight markets overall. So expect some noise. I think the industrial production, the retail numbers, the housing numbers, the pricing numbers, like all of that should have some kind of noise that's hurricane related in upcoming months, which is going to make it a little bit tricky to identify like what the underlying trend is. But I would say generally speaking, like freight demand, I think looks pretty solid, at least again through the remainder of 2018. I think the freight demand environment is going to be pretty robust, although exports and housing are going to be areas of weakness. And again, I think trucking capacity is expanding slowly. I just don't know if it's necessarily as fast as needed given some of the other areas of the economy.
Yeah, I think, as I see it, I think 3 to 4% year-over-year rate increases are probably about what we would expect in terms of year-over-year contract rate increases. We're not seeing a lot of volatility in the spot market. We're not seeing an inflationary environment in mass in the spot market, which is suggesting that the market is properly supplied at this point. But the thing that we don't know what's going to happen is how much capacity is available on intermodal and how much broader capacity can handle this e-commerce surge. I don't think anyone, including probably Amazon, has a feel on how significant of an event this e-commerce season is going to be, and so that may drive spot rates up pretty high as we move into peak.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think so. I actually think we're going to dig a little bit deeper into peak for the next webinar. But broadly speaking, I think there's a big missing piece here, which is like how fast the private fleets are expanding.
Like Amazon, how many?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like it's a pretty big deal this holiday season. Exactly how much capacity Amazon is adding for themselves.
We know that they've been adding a ton. I mean, you can go to the truck stop and they've got advertisements for drivers.
Right.
We know that there have just been, you see prime trailers on, I think they're up to 10,000 trailers is what I understand.
Right, and so, but that's going to play a role in sort of how things work this holiday season.
And how much of that capacity, that demand is contained inside their networks versus and some of these other kind of for hire networks.
No, absolutely.
So I wanted to spend 2 seconds on EMO because it has come up in 3 of the questions that we got prior to it. Is this concept of this new regulation? It regulates maritime fuel specifically. It's a new regulation that has to do with the type of fuel and emissions related to ships, and it limits the amount of sulfur that they actually have to they're permitted to put out. I believe the United Nations is the one that's actually constructed it, but it's expected to go into effect on January 1st, 2020. The question has come is what impact will this regulation of changing how, because before that, a lot of the ship lines really had unregulated fuel. In fact, I heard from one of the major ship lines, they don't even have fuel gauges on their ships, and that's a new technology for them. And so the concept of them having to change their supply of fuel to this very low ultra sulfur, what impact does that have into trucking? And one of the reasons that we have this slide up here is just the refinery, because this is really a refinery question. It's not a raw oil question. It's really refinery. The United States and Europe have have blends of fuel. But what that will do is, if they're able to implement scrubbers inside the ships, it will clean the oil that they're using. If they're not able to implement scrubbers, then they'll be forced to actually draw capacity off of the ultra low sulfur diesel supply, and that could impact trucking ultra low sulfur fuel. It is showing up a little bit in the price of diesel in the Ford. If you look at a Ford curve in it, by a couple of pennies. In some markets, as much as 20 cents a gallon. But we're not seeing the kind of draconian impact that people are somewhat concerned about. You certainly will see companies like Maersk and some of the other ship lines implement fuel surcharges on international container freight, but we're not yet seeing the trucking market really react to this. This is something we're going to watch. I would say that this reminds me of the same conversations I had about ELD. I'm having now about EMO, which is this idea that no one really knows the impact. And if it's anything like ELD is, we'll all recognize as an impact, but nobody knows how bad it's going to be. And it will probably be short-term worse than what we kind of thought. And then eventually it will edge out, but it's something to watch. So.
Awesome. Thanks so much to you, Craig, and Ibrahim and Nick as well for your insights. And thanks to those of you in the audience who submitted questions prior to the webinar. We covered as many of those as we could possibly cover in the actual presentation. But if you do have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. Related to the hurricane, what effect do hurricanes usually have on the brokered TL market?
Yeah, great question. So if you look at brokers, freight brokers operate really a lot of value freight brokers offer is mitigating volatility. And that's either providing last minute capacity volatility, providing the availability of trucks, or helping ease some of that market disruptions. They provide price discovery and market disruptions, but they make a lot of money when we have a volatile freight market. I mean, just being frank. And so in a market where you have a pretty lack of volatility, which is what we're right now had up until 2 weeks ago. I mean, August was an unvolatile market. Just didn't see the runaway kind of inflation and spot rates that you've seen in prior months. With it being sort of this hurricane not having an enormous impact on freight prices and volatility, it's not going to dramatically impact or provide a surplus to a lot of the freight brokers, unless the ones that are providing kind of that peak demand service for lease supplies. So because it's a more muted hurricane than what we saw last year, it's in a region that isn't as economically exposed to like oil and energy. I don't think we'll see a huge impact, with the exception of a couple of names in the freight brokerage industry in terms of volatility. And I don't think this hurricane specifically is going to create a tremendous amount of volatility in the freight market. We're seeing it show up a little bit in the data, but we're not seeing it in terms of en masse. When you look at across the entire market, we're not seeing it. The Southeast will be more exposed, but not the rest of the U.S.
Awesome, great. And you talked a bit about the stabilization of diesel and oil prices. Sergey says, regarding the upcoming IMO 2020 regulation, do you think this will directly affect the diesel prices and therefore the transportation industry? If so, to what extent, and how can we prepare for that effect?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard projections as much as 20 cents a gallon, which is about 12% increases in diesel is kind of the upper end of the projections that I've seen. I don't think, particularly it's going to have a much bigger impact on importers, and it's going to have a much bigger impact on any MBOCCs that are using international container freight and bulk freight. I don't think in the U.S. trucking market that you're going to see a really profound impact in spot prices of diesel. And so I'm not seeing it as an event that should cause a ton of stress for the U.S. trucking market or people buying trucking services, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on. And as we get closer to the implementation of IMO 2020, I think we'll have a better perspective on what that looks like.
Well, great. And then talking about peak season, what are your 1 to 2 most important data points for tracking this peak season build, and how are those trending today? What levels are you looking for in those metrics to tell us whether this is an average, stronger, weaker than normal peak season, and when do you expect to see those?
So traditionally, people would look at things like back to school sales as an indicator of like how strong the peak's going to be. So if you have like a strong back to school season, that means that consumers are feeling pretty good about spending, and it also translates to high peak season in terms of demand. That's been altered a little bit because people are buying more things in July. Amazon Prime Day really disrupted the way that people buy things throughout the year. So I don't know if you can necessarily look directly at just like August and September retail sales anymore. But I would say that I do look at like this kind of time frame that's going on right now for an indication for what consumer spending is going to be. And as I mentioned earlier, I think retail spending is still really strong. Anytime you get over 6% growth in the retail space, that's a good number, even with inflation being what it is. The second thing that I look for is just consumer confidence kind of metrics, things like Bloomberg Consumer Comfort, the Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index, University of Michigan Consumer Consumer Sentiment Index, right? And that'll just kind of tell you what the general sentiment is among consumers headed into the peak season. And again, you're looking at pretty elevated levels of confidence, and for those kind of reasons, and pretty strong fundamentals like good income growth and good job growth, like I just think the peak season is going to be a pretty strong one this year. Right now, I would still say stronger than what you saw last year, and last year was a good peak season also.
And a couple of questions with respect to the tariffs related to China. How do you see the trade war with China impacting domestic truckload rates and capacity? And do you think that domestic production will make up for any lost volume on the import-export side?
So, I mean, a couple things here. Like, the first piece is that the nature of tariffs is to discourage just international trade. So whatever ends up getting implemented in terms of tariffs on either side is a negative for just like trade volume. Now, whether or not that ends up being, the U.S. exporting, losing more exports than China does, or anything, I don't really know how all that's going to shake out. Again, I think things like the strength of the U.S. dollar and the strength of the Chinese economy versus the U.S. economy is going to determine sort of how things play out more than anything else. The second question is a more interesting one, which is whether or not there's enough, domestic production can pick up the slack here. If we're not importing as much as we used to from China. And I think it's a reasonable enough question. I mean, when you hear manufacturers, I mean, I talked about it earlier, manufacturers are already kind of swimming in orders that they can't necessarily fill. And if you add on another layer of that, which is sort of like additional production that ordinarily would have been imported from China, it's just going to add on to the order backlog. I think it's a real challenge going forward.
Well, the exception of a lot of the what I call low-grade retail goods, the kind of just commoditized retail goods like clothes and stuff and toys, a lot of our imports are actually raw goods. They're raw commodities that go into manufactured goods. And so it's going to be interesting to see how those cost inputs show up in how people price their products and whether it creates an inflationary environment. I don't think that I think trade gets a lot of noise. We cover it a lot. I don't think it's something that's really negatively impacting the U.S. trucking market to a degree that anyone should be overly concerned about it at this point.
Yeah. And one more question, kind of looking toward the future.
Wait, one last thing about that. It does impact the cost of trucks and trailers and tires and all the stuff. So you do see double-digit cost increases in trailers and trucks, and that may exacerbate long-term capacity. It actually might be a help to creating a slower growth in how companies add trucks because they may be more cautious to go add. So we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, great. We'll take time for one more question. To those of you who submitted questions and we did not get to those, we can follow up with you after this directly to make sure you get the answers you're looking for. But looking toward the future, what are your thoughts on driverless trucks and the economic impact that they'll have?
Everybody wants to know those.
Yeah, and how long until we see those entering the market in a meaningful way?
You're already seeing fully automatic container ports. I mean, Rotterdam, I had the chance to visit it 3 months ago, and it is a fully automated port inside the port. Now, the equipment they put on barges and trucks are not automated yet, but I would say, and it was interesting, the senior executive at Navstar, I read something, he said 3 years ago, if you'd asked him about autonomous, he would said it's decades out. He said now, I think within the next 5 years, we'll actually see autonomous vehicles. I don't know that I'm smart enough to know whether that's going to be, I certainly think the time's getting compressed, but you have a perspective on, Abraham?
Yeah, I mean, the way I view autonomous is always there's two pieces to it. There's the technology side, and then there's the implementation side. Like, I think the technology is moving pretty fast, and the fact that trucking costs have gone up as much as they have over the past year only encourages people to invest more into autonomous vehicles. But the real question is sort of like how long before any of that stuff can actually get implemented, and that involves a lot of other things like politics and you know, whether or not you can get the regulatory environment in place in order to allow that sort of thing. I think Craig is right in saying that the timeline for the technology, I think, has certainly been compressed. And when you talk to people that are involved in this sort of thing, they'll say that they've been stepping up their efforts and getting pretty good results. But I don't know how realistic it is to say, like, in the next 5 years we'll have a regulatory framework to allow for this kind of thing, because it raises a number of questions.
I think you'll see it. I mean, you'll start to see it in some of these kind of closed loop environments first, like port activity and intra-warehouse, the yard dogs, if you will, at low speeds and kind of controlled environments. And once we start seeing those kind of implemented in mass, intra-city transportation, like buses and things, once you start seeing those kind of a ubiquitous element, I think you'll start to see it expand from there. But until we see kind of intra-city autonomous and these closed environments autonomous at a level where we kind of recognize it, I don't think the public nor the regulators are ready for this technology to be ubiquitous.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you guys so much. That is all of the time that we have for today. To those of you listening in, we certainly appreciate you being here, and thank you again to Craig, Ibrahim, and Nick for sharing your insights with us today. Stay tuned for the date for next month's webinar, and if you've not already purchased your tickets, don't forget to join us at MarketWaves 18 in Grapevine, Texas on November 12th and 13th. MarketWaves is the premier event for the freight industry and will include an incredible lineup of speakers, live product demos, and a whole lot more. We are also running a flash sale that began today. We'll be running that through Friday, where you can purchase 2 tickets for $19.99 and any additional tickets for $9.99 each. These tickets normally go for $24.95 each, so don't miss out on that amazing value for you and your colleagues. To learn more about the event or to register, visit marketwaves18.com. And to access this special pricing, enter promo code TRIUMPHPAY. That's one word, TRIUMPHPAY, capital T, capital P. And thank you again for joining us today. We hope you'll join us again next month.
And thank you, and thanks to Convoy for sponsoring this. So we really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a great day, guys.